I just get the very strong sense when I see you at events that have to do with domestic, sexual or gender-based violence, when I hear you talk about this issue, I really feel that it's something that's close to your heart and something that you genuinely care about a lot.
I mean, look, yeah, it's something that I've absolutely prioritised since getting into the department, and I've been really impatient to try and do as much as I can in this space. And the reason that, you know, I'm so familiar with those people is because I've really gotten to know them over the last few years, and everything that I've done, whether it's the development of the new agency, Cuan, whether it's the new zero tolerance strategy, which is our whole of government approach to dealing with domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, or any new laws that I've brought in, it's always been in collaboration with victims, with survivors, but with all of these fabulous frontline workers. They're the people who have for years been banging the drum, been knocking on the door, been supporting victims and helping them. So they are the people and victims themselves and survivors who know what it is that we need. You know, so I've had so many meetings and so many engagements with them and listened to so much of what they have to say, and they're just wonderful people. And, you know, if there's one learning that I've taken from this department, no matter where you work, it's, you know, the only way you can change a system is by listening to those who've been through it, the good, the bad and the ugly, everything in between. And that's what I've always done. And you know, that's what I'll always do when I'm working on this issue, whether I'm in the Department of Justice, wherever I am, because it really has captured me, I think, in a way. And it's an area that I think I'll always want to be connected with or part of somehow, you know.
And I know that it was those agencies that were lobbying you exactly for an agency like Cuan. And one of the responsibilities of this new agency is to try to improve the number of refuges that we have. And I know that you know we've got Carlow, Cavan, Laois, Leitrim, Longford, Monaghan, Offaly, Roscommon and Sligo are the 9 counties that do not have any refuges. And we know that the counties that do have refuges, they're often full. So when are we going to get to the stage where we actually have the number of refuge spaces that we're supposed to have?
So it'll take time, and, you know, to my earlier remark, I'm impatient to do everything straight away, but it is a case of bit by bit, and let's put the foundations there. So, you know, even Cuan, it was about how do we have a structure in place so that no matter who's minister, no matter who's in government, no matter what the other issues are of the day, that this will continue to be a priority, and Cuan will help drive the implementation of these new refuge and accommodation. But what I found out very quickly was that the reason there's so many gaps, and as you say, where we even have refuge and accommodation, we need to double and treble it because there's just not enough space, is that there's never been an overarching plan. There's never been a coming together of all the relevant people who are needed to make up a refuge. So it's not just about the house and the physical bricks and mortar, which is really important to have somebody safe, but it's where it is, it's the staff that are there, it's the other types of services that are provided. So often there's children as well. So what I did was bring together all of the people that were connected to it. So, you know, different departments, so housing, who are key to this, public expenditure, who have the money here, my own department, children, because obviously much of this was developed through TUSLA for many years, but also then linking in with the current service providers, from Safe Ireland to the individual refuges across the country, to see how we could put in place a foundation and a structure and a blueprint as to how we can develop them. And that's happened, and, you know, that's taken a bit of time. In the meantime, we've been able to support current refuges to roll out safe houses. So it's not that there hasn't been any new developments in the last year since the strategy was launched. We'll have 30 new safe houses by the end of this year. And then all of the other projects of the counties you've mentioned, including other counties that already have refuges, but they're expanding, they're all at different stages. So we have some that are identifying a site or a building. You have other counties where we're identifying a provider, because that's been the biggest challenge, I think, in some counties. There simply isn't an organisation or a provider to do that really vital service. Some of them are at planning stages, some of them are now applying to CAS, which is the scheme through housing, to get going. So it's really exciting, because I can now start to see all of the different projects coming together. And look, some of them are further ahead than others. We'll be launching and opening the new refuge in Wexford in September just coming. We have other projects coming on stream next year, and then others that are maybe only at the earlier stages. But it was really important to get those foundations right. Again, to listen to the sector. You know, they have experience, they know what it is to run a refuge, and then how do we fill the gaps? How do we make sure we have a plan that'll work? So the strategy sets out a target to double the number that we have by the end of it, and then we need to go beyond that.
So doubling that number would bring it to 280 by 2026.
Yeah.
But if you were to follow the Istanbul Convention, which says we need one space for every 10,000 people, and previous Fine Gael-led government contested that figure for a long time, according to the new census, you would actually need 500 spaces.
So 280 is not the final target, it's just being realistic as to what we can reach for this current strategy, and then we go beyond that. And I mean, separate to that then, my own view is the person who's a victim here shouldn't be the one that's leaving their home. Like, the reason they're fleeing to a refuge is because they can't stay in their home. So why can't we change that? And it was looked at before, and it's not that it's never been looked at. There have been legal issues that have arisen, but it's very much an active action in the current strategy. So we're looking at legal ways in which we could prevent the victim from having to leave, so often with children, and it's the perpetrator that has to leave, and that work is ongoing, and I'd hope to have hopefully clear plans or a way forward by the end of this year.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because something else that has come up from the refuges, I'm sure you've heard this yourself, is that when women are lucky enough to find a refuge space, they have to stay in it for longer because of the housing crisis. And when those women and children leave that refuge, unfortunately, some of them are actually ending up in homelessness. Some of that homeless accommodation is hotels, B&Bs, and very, very unfortunately, some women look at themselves in that situation, look at the fact that their children are homeless, and then decide to go back to the abuser, who now knows for a fact that, number one, that woman already tried to leave, and number two, she obviously has nowhere to go.
And we know that when a person tries to leave, it's not the first time that they've thought about it or tried it. It's often multiple times that they've thought about it or tried, and then they eventually leave. So the idea that somebody would go back is just heartbreaking, because it's often taken months and been really difficult, and it's one of the most dangerous times as well for a woman in that situation to actually leave. So the idea that someone would then go back, and it happens all the time, it really does. When I'm speaking to the staff and the women themselves in refuges, you have people who've left and come back a number of times. There's a number of things here, and I suppose the first one is that they don't have to leave in the first instance, and I really want to see us make progress in that regard. There needs to be variations of housing for people. So the refuge is the immediate emergency support that people get, and the wraparound services and support for children as well. Safe houses then play a role where there isn't that intense need perhaps, and where somebody can be more out in the community, and that's why it's really important that they're developed as well. As I said, there's about 30 new coming on stream from last year and this year, and they're linked in with the refuges. And then beyond that, it's really important that our local authorities have very concrete actions and plans that they can then provide that support within the community as well. So there is a policy there. It's from back I think in 2017, from the previous domestic violence strategy, where if a woman presents, or any victim, presents where they've been a victim of domestic violence, they can bypass maybe some of the procedures that would be there, that, you have to be in the housing list and all of these other elements, to allow them get accommodation as quickly as possible. But to your point, it's often emergency accommodation. It's not long term, it's in a hotel. So that policy is being reviewed. And I know the Department of Housing is now looking at, well, what does that mean, and how do we follow through on some of these recommendations? So, I mean, there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of areas that we need to improve, but my priority is to try and keep victims in their home. That doesn't change the fact that if somebody leaves and there's a housing need there, but the victim has to be our priority. It has to be the overall objective here, to keep them safe.
One of the first things that you did as Justice Minister was publish the results of the O'Malley review. And if people don't remember, this was basically a plan to try to change the way we do rape trials in this country, following what I think would be fairly described as some public unease about the way the complainant was treated in the Belfast rape trial. And some progress has been made, but you know yourself, like, a lot of women and men come out of the criminal justice system and they say that was a traumatic experience. Some of them say, I wish I had actually never reported in the first place. And I'm wondering, if somebody came to you and you're talking to them as a friend now, not as the Justice Minister, could you always in good conscience say that someone should report, that someone should go through the criminal justice system, knowing that sometimes that experience can actually be nearly as traumatic as the sexual violence itself?
So I would always encourage someone, and that's me knowing, warts and all, that the system is not perfect. But I know that there are really good examples of good practice, and I know that changes are happening. So you're right, the first report I ever received in the Department of Justice, it would have been this time 4 years ago, actually, it was over the summer, was the O'Malley report, following the the Belfast rape trial, and my predecessor, looking at what had come out of that without getting into the result or what happened in it, issued the report to see and try and understand how can we improve for victims and vulnerable peoples, including children or people with vulnerabilities, their experience going through it. And it really shone a light on how bad it was and how, there still are areas that we really need to improve. So there was a lot of recommendations in it, and my one of my biggest pet hates is having a report and it's been left sitting on a shelf. So straight away, when we were publishing it, there had to be an action plan. There had to be, right, how do we get this done and how do we move on all of these recommendations? And we've thankfully moved on a lot of them. So, making sure our Gardaí, because often it's the first point of contact for a victim, for somebody who's been raped, somebody who's had a serious sexual assault. And if they don't have a good experience at the outset, they're not likely to keep going. So you have to have Gardaí who are trained, who are empathetic, who are able to support victims, that the environment is supportive. And so we developed the Divisional Protective Service units. These are specific divisions within every area, or specific units within every division, where Gardaí are specialists and trained to support victims of sexual assault, of rape, of historical sexual abuse, of serious domestic violence. But also Gardaí now, more generally, are being trained to be able to support victims when they come forward. You had really simple things, but which haven't been done yet. The introduction of preliminary trial hearings. So for victims going through trial, so much evidence and so many things are contested. So it means trials have stopped and started. And the impact that has on somebody who's already traumatised is huge. So taking that conflict out of the trial, having it dealt with before it starts, is really important. And we've put that in place, and it's now starting to be applied. And there's lots of other areas, the fact that somebody could cross-examine, like somebody who's been accused of rape could cross-examine the person that they potentially have raped, is horrific to even think about, the trauma that would inflict. So that's now limited, and that's now something that a judge can limit in trials. So there's,
what about the use of, you touched on traumatic things that can happen in that courtroom. Something that comes up a lot is the use of counselling notes, the victim's counselling notes as evidence for the person accused of rape. And I know that the O'Malley review basically kind of said that there is a law that already exists that tries to mitigate the harms of that, but in practice, in the courts, it still comes up a lot, and it's something that is either stopping victims from going to get that therapy in the first place or making them regret getting therapy at all.
So to your point that you just made, I have spoken to victims and they have told me that it's more traumatic. What happened to them with their counselling notes was more traumatic than the incident itself, which, it is just crazy that would inflict more harm than the actual act itself. So I'm very clear that I don't want any woman to go through that, or any victim to go through that, and that we need to change it, because you're right, there's a mechanism there in the law whereby someone can object to it, but I don't think it's known in a lot of instances that that's the case. It doesn't always follow through. So it's an area that I've wanted to make a change in. We've established a group with Health, because obviously the counselling records and the oversight there as well, it's through Health, but working with the Attorney General, we have a group that's looking at how we can make those changes. Obviously very conscious of the fact that people have to have a fair trial, and particularly if somebody's been wrongly accused, but it should never be the case where somebody doesn't go to counselling, doesn't get the counselling they need, or in fact what's happening now, counsellors are not even taking notes. That's not good practice. You need to be able to reflect, to be able to re-engage with your client and with the person. So the fact that that's happening now is such evidence that this needs to change. So again, and I hate saying this, we have work being done, and I hope to have the outcome of that work in the coming months, and by the end of the year that we'd be able to make progress. But there's so many different moving parts. The zero tolerance strategy, there's hundreds of actions in it, because there are hundreds of things we need to do. There are hundreds of changes that have to take place, and it's about keeping all of them moving and just getting more and more of them over the line, and that in itself creates a cultural shift and a change, and people talk about it. And the more we're talking about it, this interview, the fact that we're talking about it is so good, because it hasn't been talked about enough for so long.
And I know that we have a lot to talk about in this area. Something that has come up a lot is the perception of leniency, that when women actually go through the criminal justice system, make a complaint either about sexual violence or other forms of violence against women, they feel that the sentences handed down were too lenient. We have very well-known examples like the Natasha O'Brien case. You probably don't want to talk about specific cases, but do you feel that there is a culture in the criminal justice system where men who have been found guilty of crimes still seem to be given the right to their good name, their job, their reputation, their standing in the community? Because there are certainly victims who felt that was the case.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that probably frustrated me the most when I came into the department and started this work was seeing trials where the sentences, in my eyes, didn't match the crime. And one that will forever stick in my mind. There was a young woman who was pregnant and her partner boiled sugar and water and poured it over her. You can't even imagine it, and because the maximum sentence, because it was assault causing harm, was 5 years, by the time you take into account mitigating factors and potentially guilty pleas and time served, you suddenly have this sentence reduced to 1 or 2 years. And you think of the horror that was inflicted on somebody, and not just the physical, but the mental scars as well. And I kept seeing these type of cases going, how can these sentences be so low and how do we do it? And eventually identified that the ceiling wasn't high enough. So a judge obviously has to work with the evidence and what they have and the procedures that are there. So it's only in recent months, having enacted the legislation, that's now come into effect. So the maximum is not 5, it's 10. So if you're starting at 10, even taking mitigating factors, it allows, where you have very severe crimes where it's not a mandatory life sentence or anything else, that punishment can actually match the crime. And in the most severe of cases, where you might have multiple assaults or multiple rapes, where you might have children involved as well, I'm introducing the life sentences legislation again, which will give greater flexibility to our judges to be able to set a minimum sentence where it's a really egregious type of crime. So instead of the 12 years and parole then can be discussed after that, a judge could say 30 years. They should serve a minimum of 30 years because of what they've done. So my job, I always see, is to try and provide the parameters and the ability for, whether it's our legal professionals or a judiciary or a Gardaí, to be able to do their job as effectively as possible. But it was the one thing that I kept seeing that really frustrated me, and it took a while to figure out, well, how do we address it? Because it's not for me as Minister to say, this is the sentence you must impose. I haven't heard the evidence, I'm not in the court, but you have to have the parameters there for them to be able to work with, and to be able to support victims then as well to come forward. We have started to see an increase in people coming forward, and I think that's while people will say the figures are huge and we have a problem, I look at it in a sense that it's actually more reflective of what's always been there, that people are now coming forward, they feel more confident in coming forward. Reporting to the Gardaí has gone up, and while prosecutions are only slightly up, they're moving in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. So, to go back to your very first question, I would always encourage somebody to go forward, and we just have to keep doing what we can to improve the system to make sure it's as positive, but that they're not further traumatised going through the system.
I'm so struck when you're talking there about the solutions to things like this perception of leniency. You're talking about tougher sentences, you're talking about creating guidelines for judges. You're effectively talking about being tougher on this type of crime. And I was struck, part of Fine Gael's core identity is being this party of law and order. But I was reading back in times when you've been criticised, and there's been anonymous briefings to the media where members of your party had accused you of being woke for pursuing hate crime legislation, which is controversial, but also saying that you were going after, I think the wording was social airy-fairy issues, and that while domestic violence is important, it didn't set pulses racing in Fine Gael. I mean, how does that kind of marry up with this idea of Fine Gael being tough on crime? Or is it the case that when politicians are talking about being tough on crime, they're talking about random street violence and they're not talking about endemic, lethal domestic violence?
I think for some people, the perception of tough on crime is, guns and gangland and assaults happening on our street. But if what was happening behind closed doors every day was happening on our streets, they wouldn't be saying that. I mean, every single day there were people being viciously assaulted, beaten, raped, strangled, coerced, abused. But because it's behind closed doors, it's not looked at in the same way. And that's what we have to change. So people can call me woke all they want. I don't know what that term means, to be honest. Like, if dealing with violence against women is not seen as being tough on crime, then I don't know what else is, to be honest. So I'll never apologise for prioritising this. It doesn't mean that I've ignored other areas of my brief. It's such a huge brief in justice, and there's so many fantastic areas that I get to work in, but I'll never apologise for prioritising this. But what has to happen is that beyond me and whoever is in this next role, that this remains a priority, and that's why Cuan is so important. That's why the overarching, the structures to it are really important. So the zero tolerance strategy, there's an implementation plan every year to make sure that it's not just justice, but whether it's the actions that transport have, whether it's social protection, health, housing, that we can see, well, how's everybody doing in their actions, who's committed to it, who's progressing it, and that then comes to a committee where you have the Taoiseach that chairs it, where you have senior officials. So we've built the structures around this to make sure that no matter who's there, that will continue and it will remain a focus and a priority. But we're not where we need to be, really. I mean, we have to be honest about that. We're not where we need to be. And unfortunately, it sometimes takes incidents still, and women, unfortunately, mainly women, but obviously men as well, coming forward, telling their story, having to talk about it for people to focus on it again. And it's a real shame, but that's where we're at. But I do think we're making progress. I do think, the people that I work with, they've done this for so long, and I think, they can feel a momentum here as well, and that's coming from everybody, and we have to keep it going.
You mentioned there that you do have a gigantic brief as Justice Minister, and you have one area of sexual violence, and then sometimes that might be a little bit eclipsed by other headline grabbing areas like immigration. And just because you are so clearly passionate about this issue, you care a lot about this, you know a lot about this, you've spent a lot of the last 4 years working on this. I wonder how you feel with this new trend where people are, maybe some would argue, weaponising sexual violence and trying to say that people coming into this country, people who are coming here to claim asylum, pose a threat to women and children, and the inference there being that these are people who are going to come into Irish communities and harm women.
We just have to push back against this. I mean, I say this to people. Imagine all of the men in your family, and you can picture them, had to leave because there was a war happening in your country, because you were starving, because climate change has impacted everything around you. How would you feel if they went to another country and that's how they were treated, or that's what was thought of them? I mean, there was no logic to it. There was no basis to it. All you have to do is look at home and the fact that women in their own homes now are not safe. And it's not because some bogeyman from somewhere else has come and is, making them unsafe. It's the person that's closest to them. It's the person that they should be able to trust more than anybody else. So this is an attempt by certain people to create division, to create fear in communities. And it's not to dismiss people's fears or concerns that may be genuine. We have to talk to people. We have to make sure that the facts are clear. This attempt to link an increase in crime with an increase in migration. I mean, 20% of the people who work in this country weren't born here. They're people who've come here, who contribute in so many different ways. And it's that message that we need to get across and to get through. But social media, I think, has a lot to answer for in that regard. I mean, it's so easy just to say something and to not have to explain, to not have to be in any way held accountable, because you can just hide behind this screen. So we just have to be really dogged in pushing back on these types of attempts to divide people and to create fear.
You said there that you don't want to dismiss the genuine concerns that people have. And I suppose if you were to go back to the 2020 general election, immigration wasn't really a major political issue then. And it is going to be now, whenever we have the next general election. I wonder, would you concede that maybe there was a complacency there, that there was an assumption in your party and in others that people having an anti-immigration view was only ever something that would happen in an extreme minority, and that it wouldn't be a political opinion that would come through in your own base?
I mean, absolutely, because I spent 3 years as Minister for European Affairs, and throughout that time I travelled to every country across Europe. I spent a huge amount of time with my colleagues, and I could see what was happening in other countries. I could see immigration was becoming an issue. It was becoming very divisive. I could see that there were significant numbers of people seeking international protection in countries, and yet it hadn't come to Ireland. And this had been going on for some time. So I think there probably was a sense, well, not that we're immune to it, but it really hadn't impacted us. And I don't think for the most part that's changed, because I think the vast majority of people in this country are the same, and they still welcome those who are seeking protection. And
sure, and like we saw that with Ukraine, but I mean, we had a headline in the Irish Independent over the past few days saying, I think a fifth of people believe that white people are being replaced through immigration, which started as a far-right conspiracy theory, but I think a lot of people are seeing that now at the school gates or in their local Facebook group or the neighbourhood WhatsApp group. Like, that does feel like a completely different place to where we were even 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's worrying. I think we've all seen that and read that and asked ourselves, how could we get to this point where potentially 20% of people in the country would believe that myself, my colleagues, that other politicians are influencing this, or that we have a part to play in people who are coming here and seeking protection. The fact of the matter is the world is a really scary place for so many people at the moment. There are wars happening on so many of our continents. There are people, as I said earlier, fleeing simply because they cannot feed themselves, and other people who just want a better life. And I don't think any of us begrudge that. But I think the rate at which things have changed so quickly in this country, I don't think any of us expected it. You have the war in Ukraine coupled with the massive increase in people who are on the move globally. I mean, I think it's the most amount we've seen in terms of people moving since World War II, and this has happened in the space of 2 or 3 years. So we're all, I think, trying to grappling with the changes. But it is really, and I mean, my job and other politicians, my colleagues, ministers' job is to communicate, to get the information out there, to dispel so many of these mistruths about immigration in general. I mean, to your point, the focus is so much on international protection, yet we have tens of thousands of people who come here legally every year from right across the world, who work, who contribute, who set up new lives here, who are unbelievably valuable members of our community, and we don't focus on that enough, and we don't talk about that enough, and we do need to do more. And I have no doubt that will be a focus on for all of us, whenever the next election is, whenever we're prioritising what we need to do. But it's a focus for me at the moment. It really is. And as I said at the outset, while domestic violence is a priority, it's not been to the neglect of all of these other important issues that have to be dealt with and resourced and prioritised as well.
I hear you when you're talking about these international factors that are affecting every country, this mass migration movement across Europe, but there are things that are within our control, and I suppose specifically would have been in your control. There's been complaints that deportations weren't happening efficiently enough, that we were coming late to what seemed like common sense policies like means testing the people that come here, as well as the legacy issue now of not having enough accommodation. I mean, would you concede that you are kind of playing catch up on this a little bit?
So on the deportations, I mean, there's no country in Europe, and I suppose we take it from the context of Europe, that has been able to deport their way out of what is a really challenging issue. And we went from a situation where you had about 3,000 people a year to this year alone, and we're only at the end of July, you have over 12,000 people. So when you had 3,000 people, you had obviously a certain percentage of those would have been given approval. You had a certain percentage were rejected and went home. You had a certain percentage who would have left themselves, and then you have a smaller percentage that would have been deported. And it is a small number, but that's not where our focus should be. Yes, you have to make sure that if somebody is here illegally and they don't have a right to be here, that they're being removed. And we've ramped that up, and I'm ramping that up in terms of the supports for Gardaí and making sure we know where people are and making sure they're processed more quickly so it's easier to remove them. But actually the most effective way when somebody's been given a negative decision is through assisted returns. So helping somebody to leave, like highlighting to them that if they have a deportation order, it doesn't just affect them in Ireland. If they try to go anywhere else in Europe or the world, that is on their record, and that impacts their future, particularly if there's somebody who simply wanted to come and work and to start a new life. So it's about engaging with people and looking at different ways in which you can remove a person if they don't have a right to be here. Like the end of the road is the deportation. It's more expensive, it's more difficult to do, it's more consuming, it's not good for the individual themselves nor for us. So while it's an important part of the overall system, our energy has to be at the other end. So processing people faster. If somebody's here for 3 or 4 years, they've accumulated more rights, and at the end of the day it's much harder to remove them. Whereas if you give somebody a negative decision in 3 months, which is what we're doing for a lot of people now, and even if they appeal us and that takes a couple of months, their legal right to stay here doesn't exist. So it's much easier to remove them, to engage with them, to assist them in going home if that's what you have to do, but also it's much easier to deport them. So all of this is being done at a time when the numbers have quadrupled and quadrupled again, which has been a challenge, but it's having an impact, and it's hard to say that because it's hard to see it with the large numbers, but the numbers of people coming from countries where they had been significant are now starting to reduce because they're going into faster accelerated processes. The number of people coming without documents or false documents or trying to get rid of their documents has reduced because we're investing in staff and ways in which we can detect them and identify them. The number of people being deported has actually gone up again because we're investing in the resources. So, I appreciate, in hindsight, why didn't we do all of this a couple of years ago when the numbers were low? Hindsight is a great thing, and we need to continue to ramp up the system while at the same time making sure that people who genuinely need it, that they get the protection that they need. So it's not about being more hardlined or trying to deport everybody. It's about making sure the system works.
Okay, I just want to ask you one more question about this policy area. I'm sure you saw Sinn Féin's new policy on immigration, and I think basically, just to boil it down, it's based on the ethos that it's a bad idea to put international protection applicants into working class, under-resourced areas. And I suppose whatever people think of Sinn Féin or think of the policy, there's probably a lot of people in this country who think that this anti-immigration sentiment that we're seeing sometimes is driven by this idea of scarcity. Like, I can't get a GP appointment for my kids, I'm living in a house with my parents when I'd rather be moving out. Like, that idea of scarcity is kind of at your party's door because you've been in power for so long.
But if you look at it on the flip side as well, you have certain communities where they were about to lose a teacher, where they weren't able to get extra doctors, where they haven't had particular resources, but because you have new members of the community, suddenly schools are staying open, suddenly you have practices that are expanding, you also have new transport coming into areas, or, through the community fund, which has been developed and resourced by my colleague Minister Heather Humphreys, you have actual investment in communities where that wouldn't have happened before. So, if you flip it on the other side, there are communities that have hugely benefited because people have come into the area. So I think it's all about getting the balance. It's about listening to communities, and that's what we're trying to do. The challenge is that you have obviously so many people coming. We have an obligation